So we're in Psalm 43 tonight, which is the cry of a wronged man for a gracious intervention from heaven. It's a psalm that bears some similarities to the previous one. It ends with the same question that was posed twice in Psalm 42. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And it also speaks about going in mourning because of the oppression of the enemy. Some manuscripts actually join these two psalms together into one, but there does seem to be a different emphasis in this latter one. There's less focus on the psalmist's inner turmoil and more on directly appealing up to God for deliverance. One possibility is that this is actually a psalm of David, composed at a similar time to the previous one, which is connected to the sons of Korah, and so similar sentiments are expressed as they all face exile of some sort, most likely at the time of Absalom's uprising. Whatever the case, this psalm models for us how to respond when facing injustice and opposition. Instead of retreating into ourselves and morbidly bemoaning our situation, we're to look up to God the judge and make our cry to him. And the psalm provides us with four compelling reasons why, in times of trouble and oppression, we should be lifting our eyes heavenwards and earnestly seeking the living God. The psalm shows us he's the source of justice, the source of light, the source of joy, and the source of hope. So the first reason is there in verses 1 and 2. Our God is the source of justice. Here is David, or whoever the psalmist might be, on the receiving end of injustice. So where does he appeal for help? What kind of legal aid can he apply for? There's no earthly king he can run to, no human court where he can lodge his complaint, so he refers to the highest authority that there is, raising his voice to heaven. Vindicate me, O God, and defend my cause against an ungodly people, for the deceitful and unjust man, or from the deceitful and unjust man, deliver me, he says. That word vindicate is simply the general word for making a judgment, be that positive or negative. It can mean to preside over a case, to pronounce a verdict, or enact justice in some way. And that's one of the great roles and prerogatives of the Almighty, to sit as judge over all the earth, to determine right from wrong, to make pronouncements on human behavior, to punish the guilty, but vindicate the innocent. It's a very common theme throughout the Psalms. As Psalm 9, for example, declares, the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for judgments, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the peoples with uprightness. It's God who is the source of justice, a justice that so often cannot be obtained elsewhere, and that's why David appeals to him here. Ungodly people are opposing him. He says he needs deliverance from a deceitful and unjust man, perhaps a reference to Absalom, his own son, who had wormed his way into the people's affections through trickery and lies, and was now trying to seize the throne from his father. And there's nowhere David can turn to other than God. He hasn't got any human recourse. He was the king himself And there was no higher ruler or body that could hear his case and settle the dispute. Only the Creator could bring about the justice David longs for. So it's God he's turning to. You are the God in whom I take refuge, he says in verse 2. Or it could be translated, the God of my strength. He's likening God to a fortress, a castle, a stronghold with mighty walls that he can hide behind and be protected by. But as yet, God seems to be indifferent to his case. Why have you rejected me? He dares to cry. Why do I go about mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? He asks. God is the one he's relying on to put things right. But it feels like God has forsaken him, ignored his case, turned his back away, left him in the lurch. And yet the very fact David is still calling upon God, addressing this prayer to him, shows that he hasn't abandoned his faith and given up. He's hammering on the gates of that fortress, as it were, pleading for them to be opened up so that he can come in and find the safety he yearns for. I've got nowhere else to go, he says, in effect. It's you or I'm done for. You're the one I need. Only you can deliver me from this oppression. So even though heaven seems to be silent at present, David holds on to this truth that he's become convinced of, that the Lord is the source of justice, the one who can and does break into desperate situations and turn them around, the one who helps and defends the innocent and condemns and overthrows the guilty. And this truth is such a rock for us to cling to. We think of our persecuted brethren in so many parts of the world, shamefully mistreated and oppressed. And we don't need to wring our hands and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We can look up to heaven and know that there is a God who sees, a God who is seated on a throne specifically of judgment, a God who upholds the cause of the wronged, and we can pray expectantly to him to act in his people's defense. And we ourselves, though we may not face the kind of threats and violence common in many other lands, might nevertheless find ourselves from time to time on the receiving end of injustice. We might be maligned, falsely accused, misrepresented, made out to be hateful bigots, have our names dragged through the mud unfairly. And where do we look? Where do we take refuge? Where do we seek help and consolation in times of slander and unfair treatment? We go to the ultimate source of justice. We cry to the judge of all the earth. Now, his enacting of justice doesn't always come instantly. The impression here is that the psalmist is having to wait a very long time for God to act. But we rest our confidence in the scripturally based conviction that justice has to come in the end, because God cannot but make everything just eventually. Sooner or later, the truth will out, innocence will be proven, deceivers exposed and brought down in the end. In some cases, that may not actually come fully until the great final reckoning when Jesus comes back to judge the world. But it will arrive eventually. No one is going to be left with an undeserved cloud of shame hanging over them, an abuse or hurt that isn't righted. And so here's comfort for every wrongly dismissed employee, every falsely accused church leader, every unlistened to, trampled on congregant, every imprisoned believer, every unfairly vilified church, every harassed, bullied Christian. There's a higher source of justice than any that's available down in this world, the Lord God Almighty. He'll sort it all out in his time. And then the second reason to seek God in times of trouble is that he's the source of light. Send out your light and your truth, the psalmist continues in verse 3. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy hill and to your dwelling. So he's appealing now for something to come down into this bleak and dire situation. There he is in great darkness and gloom, and he wants the clouds to break at long last, and he wants heavenly sunshine to pour down from above upon his troubled soul. He yearns for light and truth. That is a manifesting of God's favor and a reassurance of his dependable faithfulness. Remember how it feels for the psalmist here. It seems like God has rejected him, that God has actually withdrawn his favor, as though there's this thick, heavy veil between him and the face of his Lord. He lacks that comforting sense of God's presence, that uplifting perception of God's nearness. Pierce through the gloom, he's saying to God. Scatter this fog, dispel the haze, remove the sense of distance. Make your face shine upon me. Make your favor obvious and be gracious to me. He wants God to come and illuminate his grim situation with clear and cheering evidence of his bright favor and of God's truth. It could be translated his trustworthiness or his faithfulness. He wants that to be shown, revealed, displayed. He knows God is true to his word, true to his promises, but he wants that to be made apparent and evident. And he thinks of these two things, light and truth, almost like guides or guardians leading him back into God's presence. Let them lead me, he says. Let them bring me back to your holy hill and to your dwelling. He longs to be back there on Mount Zion, in Jerusalem, in the tabernacle, praising God in public worship. And to get back to that place, he's going to need this divine assistance of light and truth. And this is what we need in our times of distress. When God feels far away to us, we need fresh light to shine down into our lives, to comfort and cheer our downcast hearts. We need light from above to bring us back into a happy, felt experience of God and joyful worship. We don't need to be brought to any physical place, any holy ground on earth like Jerusalem, but we do need to be brought back spiritually out of the dark desert season and into a radiant new summer for the soul. And like David, we have to recognize that it's only God who can bring about such a transformation. We can't work it up from down below. He's the source of life, the one who breaks into the situation with these radiant shards. He's the one who displays and dispenses the fresh favor we stand in need of, the one who can give us, if we ask him, a renewed awareness of his faithfulness and truth as he makes his presence apparent and evident to us. This is what we should be crying out for when we're in a low state, when things seem hopeless, when God seems absent. We may not be able to change the things around us ourselves. We may be powerless to lift a finger to alter our current circumstances, but we can plead for God to come and lift the darkness away, to pour a new sense of his love and mercy and faithfulness into the situation, to break into the gloom with the grace that will lead us back into brighter times. We're not just to resign ourselves to these dark periods, but to be laying hold of God, pleading with him for the light that will make all the difference. And we can be praying that not only for ourselves individually, but for the church of Christ more broadly, and the times we live in, that in these, frankly, spiritually dark days, God would lift up his countenance and there would be a season of refreshing from the presence of the Lord, where his light and his truth march forth in a mighty way, and the cause of God in the world is revived and invigorated. In seasons of darkness, this is what we must remember, that God ultimately is the source of light that's needed, and so we have to be earnestly seeking him to shine forth. Then a third reason to keep seeking God in times of trouble is there in verse 4. He's the source of joy. Anticipating his return to Jerusalem, the psalmist says, "Then I will go to the altar of God, to God my exceeding joy, and I will praise you with the lyre, O God, my God." So he's greatly looking forward to being back there in the tabernacle, the house of the Lord, giving thanks to him as the offerings rise up from the altar, making joyful music to his God. Now this, of course, is the language of old covenant worship. Before the coming of Christ, we no longer need an earthly sanctuary or physical altars or sensual forms of worship. Jesus in John 4:21-24 makes it clear that era is obsolete now, that it's not to Jerusalem or any holy mountain that we must travel to enter God's presence. Worship is now to be done in spirit and in truth, without all the paraphernalia and external ceremony of the Old Testament periods. We approach God spiritually and anywhere, without any physical aids or props required, drawing near to him simply and straightforwardly through Jesus Christ, who's offered the full, final, once-for-all sacrifice for sin out of himself, and who has entered into the true tabernacle, far better than the earthly replica, into heaven itself. And yet, though there is that distinction, David's desire still ought very much to be our continual desire, to be engaged in the praise and exaltation of our God, offering up what Hebrews 13 calls the sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name, expressed in praying and adoring and singing and making melody to the Lord with our heart. And we thus lift up our hearts to him, knowing that he is the source of real joy. Look at how the psalmist describes him here. What a lovely phrase. God, my exceeding joy. There's such an abundance, such a richness, such a fullness of joy to be known in God's presence, as the end of Psalm 16 declares. You might not be able to see much here on earth sometimes to cause your heart to sing. Sometimes you look around you and everything just seems hard and grim and bleak and oppressive. You might feel like everything seems to be against you, but there are always infallible grounds in each and every case for rejoicing in God, because he's always the same. He always remains utterly perfect, always glorious. We can always draw delight from knowing that he's still good and kind and loving and faithful and wise and righteous and in control. So here's another reason, even if you don't always feel like it, to keep persistently seeking after God, however distressing your circumstances are down here. There is a gladness, a pleasure, a cheering sense of elation to be found when you contemplate the great eternal constant of who God is, his unfailing loving kindness, his unchanging greatness and supremacy. He's the source of joy for us. And a fourth reason for always looking up to God in every time of difficulty is there in verse 5. He's the source of hope. However saddening, disturbing, bewildering your current set of circumstances might be, there's always hope to be found in God, a confident expectation that he can turn things around and bring about better days. Here at the end of the psalm is the same optimistic refrain that was there in Psalm 42. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, my salvation and my God. So what are we to do when spiritual despondency takes hold of us, as it so easily can, when we're disheartened and vexed and churned up and agitated within? The psalmist says very simply to his own soul, hope in God. Look up to him. Remember him. Stay mindful of him. Turn your gaze upon God and wait with the assurance that he will, in his own way and in his own time, pull you clean up out of the pit you're in and deliver you. A new song will be able to come from your mouth because he can be relied on to lift you up in due time. He's not going to leave you there for a moment longer than necessary. He's the believer's salvation, my salvation and my God, we read at the end of the psalm. Or it could be translated the help or the health of my countenance. In other words, he's the one who sends aid and support down from heaven to restore the shine and radiance to a believer's troubled face. He's not going to leave you in sorrow indefinitely. He's not going to abandon you to endless misery. For a season, he may well allow his saints to go through a period of affliction, to be laid very low, but winter is always going to give way to spring in the end. The night will melt away into a new dawn. Sometimes God does that in this life, bringing a period of suffering or persecution or turmoil to an end, perhaps even by a very sudden and dramatic intervention. And sometimes he releases his children from their sorrows by calling them home, bringing them into his own immediate heavenly presence, where every cause of groaning and sighing instantly disappears. But however and whenever he does it, the believer can be absolutely sure that his God will raise him up out of whatever hurricane or flood he finds himself in. There's always a sure hope of a brighter future on the horizon when the Lord, who controls the future, is the one you belong to, the God of hope, as Romans 15 calls him. The God who's overcome everything that could possibly stand in the way of a happy future for us through Jesus, his Son, wiping out sin, lifting away the curse, defeating the evil one, overcoming this fallen world, conquering the grave itself through his death and resurrection. God is the source of true hope. And that's why you can and must look up to him even in the most humanly hopeless of situations imaginable, and know your face won't be downcast, worn, furrow-browed, and tear-stained forever. Rest and relief and restoration are on their way, hurrying towards you, even if sometimes it feels a long while in coming. So however you're feeling, whatever's going on in your heart or life right now, upwards is always the way to look. What do you find when you gaze upwards? The God of justice, the God of light, the God of joy, the God of hope, the God in whom you can find your refuge in every distress, the God who intervenes and saves everlastingly through Jesus Christ, his Son. Amen.